In the dry stretch of the New Mexico Territory, where dust ruled the streets and gossip traveled faster than horses, there stood a town called Red Hollow. It wasn't large, nor was it proud, but it believed itself important enough to decide who mattered and who did not. Men gathered every morning outside Calder's Mercantile, leaning against hitching posts, spitting into the dirt, laughing at the same tired jokes. They laughed loudest at a man who never answered back. His name was Elias Crow, though most folks didn't bother using it. To them, he was just the silent cowboy. He rode into Red Hollow one autumn morning and never really left, settling into a forgotten shack beyond the cottonwoods, speaking to no one, asking for nothing. Silence unsettled people, so they filled it with mockery. They laughed at the way he lowered his eyes when spoken to, at the scar along his jaw, at the way he paid in clean coins, yet dressed like a drifter. They laughed because laughter made them feel powerful. Elias worked when work was offered. He fixed fences, mended roofs, dug wells. He never argued over wages, never complained when paid less than promised. When men tested him with insults, he responded with quiet nods. When boys followed him through the street, mimicking his silence, he kept walking. Red Hollow decided his quiet meant weakness. And in Red Hollow, weakness was something to step on. No one wondered where Elias came from or why his horse was branded with a mark no ranch nearby recognized. No, one asked why he read newspapers weeks old, as if searching for something long past. Silence made it easy to stop seeing him as a man. On the eastern edge of town lived a widow named Margaret Hale. She had once been the school teacher, back when the town pretended to care about books and lessons. Her husband, Thomas Hale, had died in a mining collapse 2 winters earlier, leaving her with a small house, mounting debts, and a town that suddenly found her inconvenient. Creditors circled her like buzzards. The bank sent letters. The sheriff delivered warnings with eyes full of pity, but hands tied by law. Margaret kept her spine straight and her voice steady, even when the laughter behind her back cut deep. She had learned that grief made people uncomfortable, and discomfort often turned into cruelty. Elias first noticed her one evening as she struggled to lift a sack of grain onto a borrowed cart. The men nearby watched without moving, offering smiles instead of help. Elias stepped forward, took the sack and set it gently down. He tipped his hat, met her eyes briefly, and walked away. Margaret thanked him, surprised by the kindness that came without words. It was the first time anyone had seen Elias help without being paid. Red Hollow noticed that too, and they laughed harder the next day. Winter crept in early that year, tightening its grip on Red Hollow. With the cold came debts long ignored. The bank, run by a man named Horace Whitlow, decided it was time to collect. Whitlow wore fine coats and carried himself like a king, though his power came from paper and ink rather than muscle. He called Margaret into his office and spoke of overdue payments, of property liens, of deadlines that could not be moved. He spoke softly, as though kindness might soften the cruelty of his words. Margaret listened, hands folded, face pale but composed. She asked for time. Whitlow shook his head. Time, he said, was a luxury. Word spread quickly. Red Hollow loved nothing more than a public fall. Neighbors whispered that Margaret should have remarried, that a woman alone had no place owning land. Others claimed her house would make a fine addition to the bank's holdings. Children stopped greeting her in the street. Invitations vanished. Grief had made her invisible, and debt had made her disposable. Elias heard the whispers while repairing a fence near the Whitlow property. He said nothing, but that night he rode past Margaret's house, slowing when he saw a lamp burning late. Inside, she sat at the table, papers spread before her, shoulders shaking. Elias dismounted but did not approach. He stood in the shadows, wrestling with something unseen. After a long moment he left. Silence, once again, chose distance over comfort. Days later, the sheriff nailed a foreclosure notice to Margaret's door. Elias happened to be passing. The laughter from across the street was loud and careless. Someone shouted that the widow should pack quick. Another joked about auctioning her books for firewood. Elias stopped. He stared at the notice for a long time, eyes dark, jaw tight. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up and tore the paper down. The laughter faltered. The sheriff warned him quietly that the law would not look kindly on such acts. Elias nodded, folded the paper, and handed it back. He walked away without a word. But something had changed. That night, Red Hollow slept, unaware that silence had finally broken inside one man's heart. The following week brought a town meeting, called by Horace Whitlow under the pretense of discussing winter supplies. In truth, it was meant to formalize the foreclosure and prepare the auction. Margaret attended, standing alone at the back. Faces turned away. Whitlow spoke smoothly, outlining the necessity of progress, the importance of enforcing rules. He spoke of Margaret's house as if it were already gone. Then, unexpectedly, Elias Crow stepped inside the hall. The room fell quiet. It was the kind of silence people didn't laugh at, the kind that pressed on the ears. Elias walked to the front and stood there, hat in hand. Whitlow smirked, asking if the silent cowboy had finally found his voice. Elias did not respond. Instead, he placed a small leather pouch on the table. The sound of coins spilling out echoed through the room. Gold, real gold. Enough to make even Whitlow blink. Elias looked up, his voice low, rough from disuse. He spoke only 6 words. Delay the auction. 1 month, the town froze. For the first time, no one laughed. Whitlow cleared his throat, masking surprise with disdain. He agreed, believing no drifter could produce more. Margaret stared, tears threatening to fall, hope and fear colliding in her chest. Elias met her eyes briefly, then turned and left. Outside, whispers exploded. Questions followed him down the street, but he did not answer. Red Hollow had laughed at his silence for too long. They did not yet understand that silence was never emptiness. It was patience, and patience, when it finally moved, could shake a town to its foundation. The month Elias Crow purchased with a pouch of gold changed. Red Hollow in ways no one expected. The laughter that once followed him softened into uneasy glances. Men who had mocked him now watched how he walked, how he counted his steps, how he never hurried yet never wasted time. Whitlow's bank window stayed lit late into the night. Papers shuffling, calculations redone. Margaret Hale lived those weeks between dread and fragile hope. She kept teaching the children who still came, tended her garden despite the cold, and waited without asking questions. Elias returned once, leaving a sack of coal by her door at dawn. No note, no words, just warmth against winter. On the final week before the auction, strangers began arriving in Red Hollow. Well-dressed men with careful manners, wagons bearing stamped crates, riders who asked questions about landlines and water rights. Whitlow smiled through clenched teeth as he welcomed them, believing himself in control. The town buzzed with rumors. Some said Elias had robbed a stagecoach. Others claimed he'd found hidden gold. None guessed the truth. Silence had protected it too long. Auction day came cold and bright. The townsfolk gathered outside the courthouse, eager as spectators at a hanging. Margaret stood beside the sheriff, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the ground. Whitlow stepped forward, voice ringing with confidence, announcing bids, praising opportunity. Then Elias arrived. He did not come alone. Behind him walked the strangers, bankers from Santa Fe, land agents from Denver, surveyors with official seals. Papers were unrolled. Deeds were read aloud. One by one, properties were claimed, not by Whitlow's bank, but by Elias Crow, the saloon, the mercantile, the livery, even the land beneath the courthouse itself. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Whitlow stammered, face draining of color, as Elias placed document after document on the table. Each bore his name. Each bore lawful seals. Silence swallowed the square. Whitlow accused him of fraud. Elias answered calmly, explaining in few words that his holdings predated Whitlow's bank, that debts had been purchased, mortgages paid, land quietly claimed over years. He spoke without anger. Facts did the work. The sheriff confirmed the legality. Whitlow's voice broke. Red Hollow realized too late that the men they laughed at had been listening all along. When the crowd thinned, Margaret remained, trembling. Elias approached her, finally speaking more than a sentence. He told her of his past, how he had once owned a thriving rail supply business, how a partner's greed had destroyed it, how noise and promises had cost him everything. He had chosen silence after that. He had invested quietly, rebuilding without spectacle. Red Hollow had been one of his long-term holdings, a place meant to grow once the rail line came through. Whitlow had stood in the way. Margaret listened, tears sliding freely now. Elias handed her a deed, her house, her land, cleared of all debt. He told her it was hers, always had been. She tried to refuse. He shook his head. Some things, he said softly, should never be taken from those who earned them. News traveled fast. Shame settled over Red Hollow like dust after a storm. Men avoided Elias's gaze. Women whispered apologies they never voiced aloud. Whitlow packed his office in silence, leaving town before nightfall. The power he thought he owned vanished with him. Elias did not punish. He lowered rents. He reopened the school. He restored the well. He offered work with fair wages. Slowly the town changed, not because it feared him, but because it respected him. Silence, once mocked, had taught them humility. Spring arrived gentle and green. Red Hollow breathed easier. Children laughed again, this time without cruelty. Margaret returned to teaching full-time, her home warm, her future secure. Elias remained quiet but no longer invisible. People greeted him with nods, with thanks, with careful respect. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Margaret and Elias sat on her porch, watching the town settle into peace. She asked him why he stayed. He considered the question, eyes on the horizon. Because, he said, a place can be saved, and so can people. They did not need more words. Red Hollow never laughed at silence again. They learned that the quiet man they dismissed had been listening, planning, protecting, and when the time came, he didn't raise his voice. He bought the ground beneath their feet and gave them a better way to stand on it.